Jason X, Chapter 8. The profoundly significant historical event that occurred in Lab 1 went mostly unnoticed by the rest of the ship. By the time Rowan had been transferred to her new sleeping quarters by Cineron and an unexpectedly solicitous Brodsky, and tucked safely into bed under the supervision of KM and Professor Lowe, Azrael was already well into the second level of Mega Hunt, with Dallas. The tranquilizer KM had dosed him up with still hadn't completely worn off, but he was feeling energetic and cheerful, and there was no better way to rehab a newly reattached arm than by hunting a few monsters. And there was no better game partner for that than an X-Grunt, for obvious reasons. The X-Grunts were all into physical stuff. It was normal life for them, not some kind of interpretation, interruption, or break in their routine. They'd get right into the spirit of the thing without getting all fussy or making some kind of big deal about violence and killing and shit. Azrael had played with all of them at one time or another, even Brodsky, who was one heavy hitter when it came to grabbing points. But his favorite to play with was Dallas, no question. Dallas was cool. He was actually from Fort Worth, or rather his ancestors were, but like the man himself had pointed out, who the hell ever heard of anybody nicknamed Fort Worth? He and Dallas had hit it off right away. They had the same taste in books, movies, and games, the same sick sense of humor, and the same totem animal, which was really an amazing thing. Azrael had met maybe half a dozen people in his whole life, who even knew about totem animals, let alone what their own was, and he had never before met another flamingo. Just looking at him, he sure wouldn't have taken Dallas for a flamingo. The guy sure wasn't very flamingo-like, not in the slightest. Not like Azrael himself was, all skinny, with his knobby knees and his big beak of a nose, which both Gecko and Briggs had said was sexy on him. Dallas was a big, bald-headed side of beef with a granite jaw and a mustache like a wire brush. His biceps were bigger than Azrael's thighs, and he could do one-finger push-ups with Azrael sitting on his back. The guy was so cool. Dallas had said the next time he was on leave, Azrael could come visit him in the Republic of Texas, and they'd go ostrich riding on the Pampas. In the meantime, however, the only thing he was really thinking about was outscoring the big man in Mega Hunt. At this point, he barely remembered how his arm had been cut off, and as the last of the tranquilizer left his system, he had all but forgotten what else had been going on in Lab 1 while the ants reattached his arm. Even the trip down to the surface seemed unreal now, like a half-remembered dream. He would have to ask Professor Lowe later if any of the stuff they had covered today was going to be on the final. Nearby, in another part of the cargo hold, the rest of the X-Grunts were keeping busy and bitching in a desultory way. Brodsky kept an eye on them, but for the most part, he let them be. His thoughts were primarily taken up with wondering about the woman they had defrosted. He had seen a number of cryos thawed out in his time, although none of them had been under for even half as long as she had, of course. And now that he thought of it, none of them had been frozen accidentally, as she apparently had been. In any case, all of the successfully resuscitated subjects had been disoriented and sluggish. Some had shaken it off more quickly than others, but even those who had achieved a fairly alert state in a short period of time had not displayed the defensive reflexes this woman had shown. Yet she was not a soldier, and he hadn't deduced that merely from the fact that she hadn't been wearing a uniform when they had brought her aboard. Brodsky could spot grunts and ex-grunts a light year away, no matter how long they'd been out of boot camp, and sometimes even their reflexes weren't that good. He had never seen anyone without military training come up swinging the way she had. Maybe he had been impressed simply because Lowe had been the inadvertent target. He couldn't say he hadn't enjoyed that one. Lowe was really getting on his nerves this trip. Kicker referred to him as Professor Smarm, and Brodsky could see why. As soon as they hit Solaris, he would make sure he and his team were rotated out. Time for someone else to babysit the college kids. Up on the bridge, Lou had left all the channels on his communication link open. He always did, not because he had an uncomfortable urge to eavesdrop on everyone, but to keep track of overall conditions while the Grindle was in hyperdrive. As unusual as he might have been among his fellow pilots in terms of his disposition, one of the things he had in common with them was a profound awareness that no ship was ever safe in hyperdrive. It was all too easy to feel otherwise, since there were no physical sensations to distinguish it from travel through normal space. But there was nothing normal about circumventing the universal speed limit. Once a ship was in hyperdrive, It had technically ceased to exist in terms of normal three-dimensional space. At the same time, however, it hadn't. For however long his ship remained in hyperdrive, it was for all intents and purposes Schrodinger's ship. It could return to normal space only if its perimeters were identical to those it had on entering hyperspace. In a state of simultaneous existence and non-existence, you couldn't take this sort of thing for granted. As a state-of-the-art space-going vessel, the Grindle was more than amply equipped with the technology to safeguard mass, density, symmetry, and so forth. But no pilot worth a damn would rely solely on the readouts from meters and gauges. You had to get a feel for what was okay and what was off. You had to smell and taste the air, listen to what the ship was telling you. Because just watching the pretty light show through the windshield wouldn't actually tell you a whole lot. Lou had long since mastered the art of monitoring everything while letting nothing distract him. He had listened with great interest while they had defrosted the woman in Lab 1. 450 years since her last date, he thought, maybe with some research scientist who owed him or her career to a mild case of Asperger's syndrome. He just might have a chance. Lots of chicks liked pilots. This one could well be partial to a mature but lively kind of guy with a great sense of humor. She was bound to notice the cowboy hat at least, so if she didn't look away too quickly, he just might be able to keep her interested. Abruptly, he caught the favor of what he had been thinking, and he winced. He had definitely been out here too long. The moment they touched Solaris, he was putting in for vacation. At least 3 weeks, maybe 4. He must have been the only person on the ship besides Crutch and KM who wasn't getting laid. Down in engineering, Crutch had not bothered to leave any channels open. Even if he had, he was too thoroughly engrossed in his latest project to hear anything short of a red alert klaxon. Trevor Crutchfield's overriding ambition was not to someday assume the pilot's chair on the Grindle or any other ship, but to become what he thought of as a Renaissance man. His notion of what this entailed was a little murky in some areas, and a lot murky in others. But in general, he took it as his personal mandate to master as many different skills as he possibly could. His half-dozen ex-wives, on the other hand, felt that this had nothing to do with the Renaissance and everything to do with an attention span so short as to be criminal. Crutch didn't see it the same way, but decided that even if they were right, he obviously hadn't mastered the art, or science, of getting married, and he should stop trying. He had since had the pleasure of discovering he could be successful in a multitude of other things, and for the most part, in far less time than it took for any of his marriages to fail. Lately, he had begun to think of himself as a Renaissance engineer, since most of his pursuits seemed to have some sort of engineering aspect to them, at least in his mind. Once he came at something from the right angle, it wasn't too long before he had it all wrapped up, or sewn up, in keeping with today's successful feat of engineering, which was needlepoint. Counted cross-stitch, to be exact, a very old and venerable skill dating from various pre-vac cultures all over Earth 1. It was something that Crutch had more or less wandered into after garment making and embroidery. Counted cross-stitch was far more time-consuming for an outcome that most engineers would have considered kind of lightweight in comparison to what they were used to. And the outcome, though aesthetically pleasing, was not exactly what an engineer would call utilitarian, unlike the additions he had made to his wardrobe. But damn, it sure looked cool, he thought as he held it out at arm's length. Engineers do it with precision. And the clothes weren't bad either, he thought, glancing down at himself. His current outfit definitely displayed the influence certain periods of pre-vac history had on him. Not Renaissance, but pirate, with flourishes that owed a great deal to the children of the Romani, whose children's children's children happened to be very much alive and well in great numbers on Earth too, and elsewhere. The clothing was comfortable, relatively uncomplicated, and allowed for unrestricted movement. It also indulged his hitherto unsuspected flamboyant bent. He liked the way he looked in them, although he thought it would probably have looked even better if his previous success with gourmet cooking had not made him quite so rotund. Counted cross-stitch didn't do much to counteract that problem. It didn't even make his fingers any thinner. But it did tap into his tendency to fidget in a way he found highly satisfying. In that respect, it was very much in keeping with the engineering philosophy. If you were going to fidget anyway, It was good to have something to show for it, although it hardly made up for the fact that he was probably the only other person on the ship besides Lou and Brodsky who wasn't getting laid. The only other person on the Grindle who was unaware of how history had been made in Lab 1 had happened to be right next door in Lab 2 during the event and managed to miss the whole damn thing, mainly because she had virtually lost all awareness of anything other than the totally fascinating, unquestionably unique, and utterly disgusting specimen on the table in front of her. She had tried to share some of its more astonishing features with Professor Lowe and the others in Lab 1, any of whom she would have preferred to have with her in Lab 2. Even Janessa, with her incredible shrinking tops designed to show off her anti-gravity boobs. For all her skimpy, barely-there clothing, the girl could still keep her mind on her work and her hands off her lab partners long enough to get some shit done, at least. But instead, Lowe had just had to stick her with Kinsa and Stoney, who were at it so much that the rest of the class had started to call them the magnetic rabbits behind their backs. She could understand why Lowe had done it. The magnetic rabbits weren't the ideal assistants for something as major as thawing out a person who had been in cryo for 450-some-odd years. She would have done the same thing and insisted it was all an educational division of labor. But there he was, all set up in Lab 1, with his viable candidate for reanimation and all the good help and no time for anything that might be going on in Lab 2. Good old Adrian could take care of everything. He could just leave the whole thing to her the way he always did. She could do all the dissecting and then index all the parts and make all the notes and analyze all the data. And if she were to be perfectly honest, she wouldn't have had it any other way. She loved the autonomy. It was the best thing about working for a lazy-ass professor. If she knew Lowe, and she did, he wouldn't bother to ask Stoney and Kinsa for lab reports, nor would he ask her to evaluate their performance, which was fortunate for them, as she might not have been able to resist the temptation to say something like, sexuality, subjects presenting continuously higher brain function, insufficient data, which would turn out to be extremely unfortunate for her if, as usual, Lowe simply added her comments to their official academic folders without reading them first. Adrian paused in the act of reaching for a scalpel and smiled to herself. It might also almost have been worth being on the sharp end of a career-ending scandal just to watch the celebrated Braithwaite Lowe tap dancing for his life, in a frantic effort to distance himself from what she had done, without making himself look like a lazy ass too stupid to know his chief lab assistant was a damn psycho. Maybe, if she had a little more nerve or a self-destructive streak that bordered on being a death wish. No, not today, she thought cheerfully as she moved to one end of the table and contemplated the hockey mask covering the face of the extremely unviable subject. If there actually was a face underneath that piece of scratched and dented plastic. Earlier, when she had removed the left eye, she had wondered if the gelatinous ruin dangling from the tip of her long-handed forceps was actually worth refreezing to scan later. It looked to her as if the organ had been a total loss long before its owner had got anywhere near a cryo unit. Then she had dropped it into the tank anyway, figuring what the hell, let Lowe find out for himself whether there was anything left to scan or not. In the meantime, she was going to leave the right eye in situ, as it seemed to be practically undamaged. Also, she could almost have sworn the thing was actually looking at her, that somewhere behind the colorless iris and the black hole of the pupil, there was a retina still functioning well enough to register her image. Adrian straightened up and took a small step back from the table, unaware that she was now gripping the scalpel so tightly that her knuckles were white. Okay, where the hell had that come from? Since when did she get so spooked by a corpsicle that her imagination went into scary story overdrive? She caught herself looking around the empty room, as if to make sure that nothing was going to creep up on her. Creep being the operative word, or to be more precise, creeps, as in, Adrian Hart got the creeps working all alone in the lab. Poor whittle kid. Hope her mommy lets her sleep with the light on tonight. Good thing no one else was around to see her being such a girl, especially the students. They'd have probably started putting frogs down the back of her shirt, trying to make her scream and run away. This was so stupid. It was nothing but stupid shit. She was disgusted with herself for wasting even 1 second on stupid shit, when she could have been taking advantage of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study the oldest human remains ever preserved in a non-mummified state. No one else had ever had a subject even half as old in such remarkable condition, and she could take it as a sure thing that there would never be another, at least not from the same era. So instead of just standing around getting the creeps, she should have been getting busy. And that was the end of that. Case closed, she told herself. Thank Christ that silly moment, whatever it was, had passed. So she didn't have to force herself to move back to the table and start cutting that plastic mask off its face. Its face. She was back to normal now. Everything was normal now. She didn't have the creeps at all. All it really had been was a reaction to the fact that the corpse had begun to smell, which was just one more normal human response to stimulus. The more the body thawed out, the stronger the smell would get. Also normal. She had actually been feeling queasy, not creepy, something that happened to even the best of the brightest. Albert Einstein himself had probably held his nose once or twice, and as for Lowe, he would probably have been in an environmental suit by now, assuming he hadn't run off at the first faint whiff of decay, of course. But she was made of much sterner stuff. If the smell really started to bother her, she could just pop a filtration mask on. Anyone who wanted to make fun of her for that could just go right ahead, as long as they came into the lab and did it barefaced and without puking. She could assume, with every confidence, that there would be no takers. And no, she said to herself silently, she wasn't going to call the ex-grunts and dare one of them to do it. She didn't goof around like that in the lab, and that's all it would have been, just goofing around. She had wanted to work alone. She didn't need company. She didn't even want company. She finished sawing around the edge of the mask and set the scalpel down with a little more force than necessary, just to counter the silence. This was going to be messy. No, it already was messy. Despite the effort she had made to cut no more deeply than absolutely necessary, an abundance of thick fluid was oozing out of the incision all the way around the mask in a gory outline. Strange stuff it was, too. It sure didn't look like blood, not even blood that had been cryogenically frozen for almost 500 years. Not that she could base that judgment on any sort of solid experience, but still. Maybe whoever had put this guy on ice had replaced his blood first? But with what? This stuff looked like mud from the bottom of a stagnant pond. Or maybe a lake, she thought suddenly with a silent, nervous laugh. Lowe had showed her a map of the sites they were going to visit, and she seemed to remember that the name of the last one was Lake something or something Lake. Silver Lake, Clear Lake, Clearest, Crystal Lake. That was it, Crystal Lake. Not exactly the most unforgettable name you could give a lake. Her gaze fell on the unblinking eye staring out from behind the mask. On the other hand, it was a lot better than Eyeball Lake. She permitted herself another small laugh before she began trying to work her gloved fingertips under the edge of the mask so she could lift it away. She managed to loosen it slightly, but otherwise it refused to budge, as if what she had been trying to remove was not a mask at all, but his actual face. Perhaps it was. Perhaps there had been a severe overgrowth of bacteria and mold between the epidermis and the inside of the mask, which had caused the skin and plastic not merely to adhere to each other, but, for all intents and purposes, to meld together. In order to reach that state, the mask would have had to remain in place for literally years. A pretty implausible scenario. And that physical discomfort would have been intolerable very quickly, and he would have removed the mask long before the process could begin. Unless he had been forced to wear it. Good God, though, why? As an experiment? Or punishment? Adrian winced. What a lovely turn of thought. Old Earth might have been rougher than what people on Earth 2 were accustomed to, particularly in the area of sensibilities. The growing stench from the body on the table, for example, would not have been unusual in most places on Earth 1, whereas you'd never smell anything half this bad or this strong in any area where people live now. But the planet hadn't been totally the domain of savages either. Not totally, even as some of the things pre-vac humans had done to each other made forced mask-wearing seem tame. A ghost of an idea tickled at the edge of Adrian's mind, making her frown. Something about forced mask-wearing or masking. It had something to do with covering up as a matter of religious law. She knew any number of students and faculty at New Harvard who wore burqas and chadors. But hadn't there been some old Earth faiths that had gone much further in requiring constant coverage, literally from head to toe, with severe penalties, even brutal punishment for those who flouted the rules even just by accident? Covering up so completely would have involved a fair amount of physical discomfort. But if the alternative had been an extended, vicious beating, people would have found a way to tolerate the intolerable, even believing that their suffering was a contributing factor in their salvation. As implausible as that might have seemed on the surface, there were a number of present-day religious groups on Earth, too, who subscribed to some variation of those beliefs, and at least a few of those groups must have been as arcane as any cult that had ever come out of old Earth's darkest shadows. Adrian could not even keep track of all the relatively unesoteric denominations and sects on Earth, too, or their beliefs and customs. No mystery, then, as to why she couldn't think of an Earth One religion with mandatory hockey masks. Besides, she was almost a doctor, not a game show host, or Braithwaite Lowe, whichever applied. She tried rocking the mask from side to side and then tried twisting a little. There was an awful wet squelching sound, and she felt something give slightly. Sliding her fingers further under the mask, she shifted position so that she had hold of the top and bottom instead of the sides, and tried rocking it again. The squelching sound was louder, and she felt something that might have been ligaments or small muscles ripping. The sensation raised the small hairs on the back of her neck, and she nearly snatched her hands back, feeling a queasiness that had more to do with her spirit than any physical sensations. This was too much like an autopsy rather than a scientific dissection, she thought, and she absolutely did not do autopsies under any circumstances. She had made that long-standing policy a condition of employment on every contract she had ever signed. A non-scientist might not have seen much difference between the two, but they really had nothing to do with each other. An autopsy was a procedure intended to determine a cause of death, whereas a dissection was an extensive, detailed examination specifically to gather data and increase knowledge, which was really all about life, not death. Adrian took a steadying breath and repositioned her hands, wiggling her fingers a little in an effort to get them farther under the mask. Gradually, it began to loosen some more. There was no telling how much of the actual face would come off with the mask, but it was probably going to be a lot. She had to control her impatience, go slowly, or she would end up ripping out chunks of subcutaneous tissue as well. She just wished the damned eye didn't look so much like it was watching her. Then all at once she felt the mask pull free, and she hesitated, just in case there was a sudden gush of fluid that had been bottled up behind the plastic. But although the smell became a bit stronger and more unpleasant, nothing happened, and she lifted the mask away. Adrian made a noise that was equal parts dismay and disgust. That strangely unclouded eye was the only indication that the grotesque ruin around it was the remnant of a human face. But she could see that even in its prime it hadn't been a very pretty face. The skull was misshapen, the facial features asymmetrical and uneven, as if everything had had a separate and drastically different rate of growth. Nature had made some pretty terrible mistakes. It was actually rather amazing that anyone so deformed could have lived to adulthood. Biological adulthood, that was. She remembered how little brain tissue had shown up in the cranial scan, which meant that he had been mentally impaired as well as deformed. No doubt this had inspired society as a whole to treat him with something less than compassion. She didn't want to think about what his life must have been like. "Poor baby," she muttered. "I can see why you wore this thing." Adrian knew that Lowe would expect the mask to remain off, but she just could not bring herself to put it aside in the specimen tray. It seemed wrong to leave him exposed now, even if all his troubles were over. Under the circumstances, he wouldn't have looked too good even if he had been Adonis in his pre-vac heyday. But after a while, she would have stopped noticing a normal face. This one would make her wince every time she saw it, even if it was just the briefest glimpse in passing, and that would be like the final insult. Like the uncaring universe tormenting him even after death via her squeamishness. No, he could stay masked until it was absolutely necessary. After all, this wasn't an autopsy. What she intended to do was examine the biochemistry of what had been his life, Thus, she could afford him that much respect. She replaced the mask, pressing it down firmly, and was surprised to feel how securely it re-adhered to the tissue underneath. The way it stuck seemed practically magnetic. Well, it had been in place for close to 500 years, and over 450 of those in an uninterrupted deep freeze. So for all intents and purposes, it was his real face. Only the nano-ants could have made it more a part of him, in a literal sense. Adrian plucked the eye she had removed out of the frozen nitrogen tank with her long-handled forceps and set it carefully in the optic scanner's smallest specimen bay. Suddenly, from somewhere behind her, she heard a tiny but distinct crack, and jumped so violently that if she had still been holding the frozen eye, it would have flown across the lab and shattered. She looked around wildly and then saw that she had been frightened by a small chunk of ice that had fallen off the subject as he continued to thaw, and was currently melting on the floor underneath the table, a menace to no one except the fleas Lou accused Crutch of having. Adrian wiped a hand over her face. God, don't start with the creeps again, she told herself. You are in a sophisticated, state-of-the-art laboratory, and as well-equipped and spacious as it is, there's no room here for hoodoo, voodoo, or woo-woo. She turned back to the scanner and then paused to lean over and speak into the voice-activated microphone on the console to her left. Prepare organ vats, she said. Liquid nitrogen mix. Now the only thing she could hear was the pleasantly airy sound of liquid nitrogen flowing into the vats as she focused her attention on the optic scanner. Chapter 9. Jason Voorhees was the name of the thing lying on the table in Lab 2, but only technically, which was to say, it was a formal identification imposed on him by a world that hadn't actually cared what his name was, as long as he had one. In this way, beans could be correctly counted, statistical consistency was preserved, and the barbarian horde could not get through the gates. There had been other far less formal designations imposed on him. Freak, retard, and pain in the ass were the ones he heard most often. Sonny, Precious, and Mommy's Angel had cropped up only a very few times in the distant past. But the world hadn't cared about those either. They had absolutely no impact on anything important. What the names meant, the circumstances that inspired them, their effect on the individual designated as Voorhees Jason, none of that made the slightest bit of difference to the overall system of Western civilization. Assuming there ever was such a thing, of course. Gandhi had thought not, although he had been all for its inception. The Mahatma was many years gone by the time the little boy named Jason Voorhees had come along. Jason's short, unhappy life, so overloaded with cruelty and neglect, that what little bit of kindness and love he did get could not possibly have made up for it, would have served as a strong argument for the Mahatma's contention that Western civilization did not exist. The great man might even have shed a tear or two for Jason's victims as well. But he certainly would not have been surprised. If Jason Voorhees wasn't real to the world was all too real to him, and it reminded him of its reality by continuously inflicting as much pain on him as possible. And then, just when he thought it was all over, it wasn't. Over and over again. Jason Voorhees was the name of the thing lying on the table in Lab 2. But only technically. In truth, there was no name for the thing on the table. Nothing that was both succinct and accurate, anyway. It had no need for a name because there were only 5 elements in its reality. 2 major, self and prey, and 3 minor, weapons, obstacles, and killing ground. Such simplicity precluded the need for thought processes, so appropriately enough, there were none. Its behavior and action stemmed from an elemental level. It was as it was, because it was. In the past, some people had called this element pure evil. The more accurate term would have been anti-life. The Jason Voorhees creature was not alive in the way human beings were alive. If it had been, then it could have been killed, and killing it was patently impossible. Even disabling it just temporarily was incredibly difficult, and never lasted for very long. Of all the people who had tried to put a stop to Jason, Rowan LaFontaine was the only one who had anything close to success. If humanity had died out when the world had ended, when life on Earth 1 became impossible, it would have been a real success of sorts, and that Jason Voorhees would have remained inert virtually forever. However, existence on the elemental level had given the creature a built-in awareness of living humans. Although humans had left the planet altogether, they still lived, and thus still registered in its reality as the other major element, which caused it to respond accordingly, specifically with the compulsion to destroy. Living things had many purposes, and the most basic one of all was, of course, life itself. By contrast, anti-life had one purpose, and one purpose only: to cancel out life, to kill. Cineron's experience in the area of sexual matters was nowhere near as extensive as Kensa's or Stoney's, but that was true of most people. However, he did know a perfect pair of breasts when he saw them, and the breast he was looking at right now definitely qualified. They were perfectly symmetrical, firm but not defying gravity or protruding aggressively, rounded without actually being too ball-like, and sized in a proportion appropriate to the rest of the body. Good nipples, too, healthy color to the areola, which was just slightly larger than the circle he could make with his thumb and forefinger. "What do you think?" KM asked. The sound of her voice made him jump slightly, and he realized that he had been standing there staring at her naked chest for quite some time. In fact, if he was completely truthful, he would have to admit that he had been so engrossed in those breasts that he had more or less forgotten KM was in the room with him. And them. "Do you like them?" "Oh, yeah, sure," he said offhandedly, shrugging. "They're great, they really are. I wasn't sure that the polyesterine would bind properly with your..." Abruptly, the nipples he had been admiring slid out of place and down, dropping off the curve of her breast to land on the floor, with the unfortunate sound of 2 coins that had fallen out of someone's pocket. KM looked down at them and then at her breast, which were now perfectly featureless. "Aw, geez," Cineron said, feeling awkward. "That's, too bad. Maybe I could double the glucosamine." KM raised her head to look at him, her expression hopeful. "And will that fix them?" "Probably not," he sighed. "Look, KM, I don't think this is going to work. Why do you want those things anyway?" KM blinked at him, seeming surprised that he had to ask. "Janessa has them." Now she actually sounded defensive. Looking into her eyes, Cineron found himself wondering if he had missed 1 or even 2 cascade events. He made a mental note to check her readings more frequently. Yeah, she does," he said. "But Janessa, well, she's..." "Real?" Now she was looking at him with no expression on her face at all. Cineron hesitated. "Yes, exactly, she's real. Look, KM, let's not complicate things, all right?" He added quickly as she started to say something else. "I like you just the way you are. I really do. I think you're perfect, okay?" She didn't say anything for a long moment, then a faint smile touched her lips. "Okay." "Good." He closed her blouse up and gestured for her to sit down. She chose one of the folding chairs at the table, where his empty breakfast dishes were still stacked and waited to be cleared. She gave them an amused glance that Cineron was sure would have fooled anyone unaware that KM stood for Knowledge Matrix, and not, say, Catherine Mary or Karen Melinda. The Knowledge Matrix format was his specialty, and had been for most of his life since his childhood. He had not been an overall prodigy, like Azrael, but his affinity for intelligent machines had become apparent early on, strongly enough to make all 4 of his parents extremely nervous about leaving him alone with mechanisms more sophisticated than a rope and pulley. Years before he had been allowed to enroll in his first elementary neural networks course, he had been tinkering with Knowledge Matrix projects. KM-14, currently sitting at his table and snickering silently at his sloppy housekeeping, had been full of surprises from the moment she had been activated. For one thing, he had found himself automatically saying she and her rather than it, even in his private notes. What made that even more surprising was how long it had taken him to notice. Then there was her behavior in general. She was quirky. Not all the time, but unpredictably, often in response to some stimulus that he couldn't always identify with absolute certainty. Sometimes he couldn't pinpoint what she might be reacting to at all. This latest request for nipples had had him baffled, at least until Janessa was mentioned. The fact that KM had wanted nipples not because all women were supposed to have them, but because Janessa had them, had given him a great deal to think about. In no way had he programmed the knowledge matrix to mimic human behavior with any subroutines having to do with mammalian competitive drive, and yet she had just admitted, albeit somewhat indirectly, to feeling threatened by Janessa, or at least by her nipples, for reasons that apparently involved him. What do you think? Do you like them? Those were the questions she had asked. This was starting to get very complicated. No, it had already gotten very complicated and was only becoming more so. Syneron sat down at the computer and called up the data from KM's last 3 diagnostics so he could compare them. There had definitely been some cascades he was unaware of. He started to search the data, looking for some trace of catastrophe pattern. Catastrophe was the only thing he could think of that wouldn't necessarily show up overly unless the knowledge matrix had experienced an actual cascade failure. Or maybe he was just imagining the whole thing due to certain environmental stressors. He was probably the only person on the whole ship besides Lou and Crutch who wasn't getting laid. He sneaked a glance at KM when he thought she wouldn't notice. She turned to him with a pleasant smile and winked. If Syneron would just take her hardware and storage to the maximum now, her knowledge matrix could grow into it. Then he could forget she was an android for the rest of his life, if he wanted to. She wouldn't have minded. Well, there was a long way to go before they got to that point. Right now, she would have settled for nipples that were at the very least as successful as Janessa's. Once she got a good pair of those, then maybe she and Syneron wouldn't be the only 2 people on the whole ship who weren't getting laid. The nipples currently on display in Braithwaite Lowe's quarters belonged not to Janessa, but to Lowe himself. The celebrated professor had certain inclinations that were not found in the top 10 most popular sex acts. Probably not in the top 100 for that matter, Janessa thought. No doubt he liked to describe his particular taste as exotic, but the only word that she would have had for it was silly. But at least it was the kind of silly that didn't require her to be on the receiving end of anything strenuous, painful, or disgusting, and she really couldn't thank him enough for that. This was not the first time she had elected to pass a midterm by this method. It certainly could save a great deal of time and effort, which she could put to much better use indulging her own pleasures. There had been a couple of occasions, however, when she had seriously considered studying instead, but she had really gotten lucky with Lowe. She didn't have to dress up in some kind of costume. He did that himself, if you could call a transparent pink negligee a costume. Hell, she didn't even have to take off her clothes. The only nipples the great man was really interested in were his own. Today, it was the left one. "Harder!" Lowe begged, writhing in pleasure. "Harder!" Janessa shifted position slightly, so that she was straddling him more securely, and tightened her grip on the chrome tongs. So much for the old useless-ass nipples on a man thing, at least where Lowe was concerned. All he ever wanted her to do was take hold of one or the other with a shiny pair of lab tongs, the kind with the no-skid ridges on the business ends, not the smooth-headed clamps, and twist away while she talked dirty to him, or rather, what he called dirty, which she thought was just as silly as what he called sexy. But what the hell, one man's meat and all that, and better his meat than hers. She took a swig of champagne and leaned forward slightly. "Who's been a naughty little boy?" she purred. "I have," Lowe said proudly, writhing more intensely under her. As usual, he had a real whopper of a hard-on, and it was a whopper on Janessa's personal scale of measurement. He registered well within the cucumber range, something that seemed to be the universe's best-kept secret, or at least New Harvard's. It was such a shame to let equipment like that go to waste. Sometimes she actually fantasized about persuading the great man, emphasis on great in this context, to let her drive for a change. Then maybe she wouldn't be the only person on the Grindle besides Crutch, Lou, and Syneron who was engaged in some kind of sexual activity, but not actually getting laid. "Harder!" Lowe demanded. "Oh, you want it a little harder?" she said, taking another swig of champagne. Jesus, it seemed like each successive session was rougher than the last one. Maybe she should have made him sign some kind of contract, indemnifying her of all liability in case his nipples fell off. If she twisted any harder, this one just might. Instead, she decided to compromise by pushing the tongs down harder against his chest. "How's that?" Oh, yeah, he's saying, smiling hugely as he rolled his head from side to side. Yeah, that's it. Janessa was relieved. She didn't really mind indulging his pleasure-pain thing for the sake of a good grade, but the rough stuff really wasn't appealing to her in the slightest. That's it, right there? She asked, pushing the tongs into his chest with even more force. Oh, yeah, right there, he moaned. She paused for another healthy swig of champagne, and then set the bottle down so she could grab the headboard and steady herself. The professor was really active now. The pink negligee was starting to get all sweaty. Daddy likes it hard, she purred teasingly. Yes. He bucked underneath her, and she heard the negligee rip a little. Steady there, cowman, or you'll be up all night sewing, Janessa thought, suppressing a giggle. It was cowman, wasn't it, and not bullman or horseman? Daddy wants it hard, she asked him, holding on with some difficulty now. Yes, he shouted. Harder for Daddy. Harder, harder. God damn it. She didn't think she could push any harder without actually stabbing him. Plus, her hand was starting to cramp. The next time they did this, she was going to bring electrodes. Better living through technology. Daddy likes it hard, she teased, gripping him between her thighs. All at once, the hand holding the tongs did cramp painfully, in such a way that she couldn't have stopped squeezing even if he had screamed for her to let go. Actually, he was screaming, but not for that reason. You pass! He shouted joyfully and went limp under her. Thank God that was over with, Janessa thought. She worked the tongs out of her right hand with her left and then massaged the clamp away as quickly as she could. Lo was too blissed out to notice. Definitely electrodes next time, along with the waiver of responsibility. In Lab 1, Waylander took a break from reviewing the data on the 21st Century Woman and wondered if he were the only person on the whole ship besides Lou and Crutch who wasn't getting laid. In Lab 2, Adrian stared through the electron microscope at the sample of black ooze and wondered if she was losing her mind. This was the third sample she had taken, and the stuff was still all wrong. Therefore, she was going to have to conclude that the first two samples had not been anomalous due to some kind of contamination. Nor was there anything wrong with the microscope. Whatever this gunk was, it wasn't organic, and it wasn't inorganic. Nor was it a mixture of the two. It was as if someone had constructed a representation of a cell made out of artificial materials exactly to scale, and, despite the absence of any living components, the cell had somehow come alive, dividing in the standard cell fashion to produce the black ooze. Except it wasn't alive. It behaved as if it was, but it wasn't. There were none of the standard biochemical processes. The cells needed no oxygen or, as far as she could tell, anything else. It was like finding a rock that could grow, move, and initiate activity, but didn't need to breathe or eat. Except the crystalline rigidity of a rock was completely absent. A flexible rock? A resilient rock which, if you chipped a piece off, would regenerate the missing material? She sat back from the microscope and put the hills of her hands over her eyes, which had begun to water. It was quiet in the lab again. The vats were all full, so the liquid nitrogen flow had shut off. She had been so busy wondering if she were hallucinating that she hadn't even noticed. But now that she had, she was getting the creeps all over again. Now she could hear the drip, drip, drip of melting ice as the thing on the table continued to thaw. She glanced over her shoulder at it. Had it changed position since she had last looked? Or was it just that its clothes, no longer frozen stiff, were collapsing and resettling? All at once she was very sorry that she had been so quick to get rid of Stoney and Kensa. But seeing as how she had, certainly they must have had plenty of time to do whatever they had to do. Shouldn't they have been done by now and on their way back to resume their coursework? Sure, why not? These were the magnetic rabbits, after all. How long could they possibly take? She looked at the door. It stayed closed. Okay. She had to allow time for them to put their clothes back on, or dig something else out of their closets if they had gotten too energetic. They'd probably take a shower as well. Together, of course. But all right, so how long could all that take? That would depend on whether their getting clean together inspired them to get dirty all over again, she realized. Damn it. Her gaze wandered back to the creature on the table. There he is, she thought sourly. My date for the evening. She sighed and turned back to the microscope. Behind her, The thing on the table twitched for the first time. In fact, for the last several hours, Jason Voorhees had been, well, what was the right word? Conscious, awake? Neither term seems applicable to anti-life. No longer dormant was perhaps closest to the truth. Finally, the stiffness that had held him prisoner in the deep freeze let go of him, and for the first time in over 4 centuries he moved. Only a few clumsy twitches at first, since what passed for a central nervous system in him was not yet functioning well enough. Even though his body was neither really alive nor dead, it was still subject to certain limitations after being inert for so long. Meanwhile, the rage inside of him intensified. The creatures lived. He could sense them, sense their breathing, their hearts beating, their flesh growing warm, stretching, flexing. He sensed the nature of their thoughts and emotions, sensed the electrochemical reactions running along their nerves, sensed the contact all of them made with each other, the strongest of all being Kinsa and Stony. If Jason sensed them, however, Kinsa and Stony sensed nothing out of the ordinary, although ordinary was not a word either of them would have used to describe their lovemaking. Neither would they have described it as lovemaking for that matter, in spite of the fact that without realizing it, they had segued from pure gratification into the realm of emotion, while the Grindle was still on its way to Earth 1. Exactly when they would realize it was completely unpredictable. Socrates may have been right in noting that the unexamined life was not worth living, but he could also have mentioned that a good many life situations should be given over completely to the act of living first and examined later. Both Kinsa and Stony did this intuitively, which made them even more offensive to the embodiment of anti-life in Lab 2. It didn't help that Adrian's mind had wandered from the immediate task of gathering data to what she was going to do when the Grindle reached Solaris. She had been to all the orbiting cities several times, and Solaris was far and away her absolute favorite. It had the best clubs, the best food, the best music, and the best-looking guys. Even the maintenance staff were worth a second look or more. Perhaps she could actually sign out for a whole semester and explore hedonism for a change. She sighed. Or she could knock off the double talk for a change and just admit to herself that what she wanted was sex and plenty of it. She was probably the only person on the whole ship besides Lou and Crutch who wasn't getting laid. Adrian heard a noise behind her as if someone were getting up from the table, and she couldn't help jumping off the stool as she turned around. But there was no one there. Literally no one. The body on the table had vanished. She did not cry out in surprise or fear. It did not register that all the sights that could have greeted her when she had turned around. This was the most impossible. Nor did she wonder how the hell it had happened. Adrian had only enough time to blink at the small bits of melting ice and dirt left behind on the empty steel surface. Then it had her. It was not that he had read her mind so much as simply that he understood the nature of her thoughts. Desire for company, for human contact. Desire to be desired, desire itself. Desire meant life, and life had to be wiped out. He grabbed hold of her hair, digging his thick fingers in deeply. She screamed in terror and pain as a good many of the long blonde strands were ripped from her flesh. Her flesh. There was entirely too much of that on display. Her silly, manicured claws tore at his fist, still buried in her hair. To no effect. He slammed her head against the console where she'd been sitting, and then yanked her backwards against another counter. This one had a great deal of breakable equipment on it, and she screamed even louder as some of the jagged fragments flying up in all directions hit her. Screaming, screaming, screaming. These creatures were always screaming. He became inured to screaming long ago. Quite often, screaming would quickly bring more victims to him, but so far no one else had come rushing into the room in a futile attempt to save the live thing. He already knew she wasn't alone here, wherever that was, so it had to be that no one could hear her. He tested that theory by hauling her across the room and smashing her face first against the glass portion of the wall between this room and the one next to it. There was no response to the woman screaming and pounding her fist on the glass, although he knew there was someone else on the other side. He knew where all the humans were in this strange place. He knew that they were all contained with him in a limited space. It made a smaller killing ground than he was used to. They would die faster. He yanked the struggling woman away from the window and dragged her across the room by her hair. She had dug out one of his eyes, and because he had still not been able to move, he had had to lie there and watch as she came towards him with that shiny tool in one hand, watch through his remaining good eye as she poked that long piece of metal into his eye socket, and felt around until she had found what she wanted. It hadn't taken her long to realize he was watching, but like all the rest of the shaved apes, she had refused to believe what she knew was true, simply because it would not have registered on one of the measuring devices in the room. Not that it would have mattered either way. He would still be killing her now. She had also removed his protective mask during the period when he was immobilized, but she had put it back. Unlike the eye, which she had frozen again, he had heard the tiny sound of it happening, the ruin of his eye instantly turning to cold crystal more brittle than glass. He didn't need the eye. The cells in the empty eye socket had regenerated enough to give him a form of sight. She could have gouged out his right eye and frozen that as well, and it would have more or less grown back, in a way. But she had violated him. Like all of her kind, all those pretty, self-involved, happy, horny young people who got everything they wanted, no matter what it was. Money, good looks, attention, all theirs, just given to them. Once he had been human, but he had not been one of them. He had been something for them to laugh at, torment, even torture, or ignore as it pleased them. And there had been nothing he could do about it. Now he was no longer human, and he could do anything he wanted, including take away everything they had. Right now he would start with the one who had violated him. He had not been able to see what she had done with his eye, but as soon as he spotted the sink full of mist, he had known somehow. Then as he dragged the woman closer, he could feel the cold coming off of it in waves, and he knew he had guessed right. The struggling, screaming woman seemed to understand what was going to happen. Her movements became more frantic the closer they got to the sink. Perhaps she was more open to believing what she knew now. Not that it would do her any good. Keeping a tight grip on her hair, he clamped his other arm tightly across her upper body and squeezed. And despite her screams, he could hear the sound of her sternum and ribcage cracking as he crushed her against himself. She was still screaming as he turned her body along with his around to the mist and plunged her face directly into it. Her scream acquired a liquid sound for the last second or two before it cut off completely. He held her there a moment longer and then yanked her upright again to see the results. The thick layer of ice and frost had obliterated her face almost completely, leaving only vague indentations to mark where her features were, except for her mouth, which was more defined because it had been wide open when it had frozen. It looked like a miniature shallow ice cave. He dug his fingers even more deeply into her hair, which had been left untouched, and slammed her head down on the counter next to the sink. Her face shattered into billions of sparkling pieces. When he lifted her head again, half of it was gone. There was only a raw red wound left behind. Satisfied, he discarded the body and moved towards a tray where a number of very shiny instruments had been neatly laid out. There were actually several trays with a variety of shiny instruments on them, but the ones on this particular tray were all bladed. He picked up the largest one and took a close look at it. Good metal, very sharp with a lethal curve to it, about the same size as his machete, which had gone missing. It didn't have the same kind of handle, but that was all right. It would still serve the same purpose. It would still do some serious damage. Okay, this has been chapters 8 and 9 of Jason X, the novelization of the movie. And once again, I feel like there was quite a bit of filler tonight, but Jason is awake, Adrian's head has been smashed, and I feel like now there is not a lot of reason for filler. And yes, that whole scene with Professor Lowe and Janessa, that was just as cringy for me to have to narrate and voice act, as I know it was cringy for you to have to listen to. So I'm just going to pretend like that never happened. I'm going to put that way back behind me. Apparently, Daddy likes it rough. That's all I can say about that scene. Sorry you had to listen to that, but it was part of the book. Anyways, back to what I was saying about the filler. Here we go. Jason's alive on this ship. People are going to die. And I'm hoping that from here on out in the book, the filler can be done with. I mean, literally, I feel like I could have skipped a lot of tonight's chapter, like the what was written, and nobody would even notice. I mean, I think a lot of it was just overdone, and the last upload was like completely filler, in my opinion. But let me know what you guys think. Now that we're finally past this filler and getting into the meat of the story, Jason's awake and ready to wreak havoc again. And I hope that the book picks up being as good as it was at the beginning of the book, because the beginning really had me hooked. And the past 3-4 chapters was kind of meh, but I feel like we're getting back to the good stuff, and I'm looking forward again to what comes next. Alright guys, I'll be back later with some more of Jason X, the novelization of the movie. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, thanks for your patience through the filler, and I'll see you next time.